All right, welcome back, nerds. Today we are going to be talking about the powers delegated to the president. The powers delegated to the president have not changed since 1789. Yet the power of the president has grown exponentially over the last 240 years. This is due in no small part to the increasingly complex social and economic systems we live in. The Constitution was written before there were street lamps, and the world has changed in many ways since James Madison could have ever known. Today, automated drones can deliver Amazon packages to my doorstep and drop deadly bombs in Pakistan. I can make automated fart noises and download the new Adele single on my tiny black rectangle in the palm of my hand, which can also transmit my voice, words, and images to friends all over the globe. Many would argue that the power of the president has changed to meet the needs of the time, while others argue that these changes were unconstitutional power grabs. Either way, the scope and power of the president have changed over time as the United States has become a global superpower. Hence, the support staff of the president has grown to meet these needs. As the executive branch employs 2.8 million civilians to execute, enforce, and carry out the laws across the country. The president doesn't have a legislative body of 535 people, and thus he can act with expediency in times of crisis, increasing his or her power. Congress has over time conceded more authority to the executive branch, and the judicial branch has frequently interpreted that power as being constitutional. And finally, one of the contributing factors to this is that many American people welcome a powerful president who can get things done, or at least they are indifferent to the power of the president until that power encroaches upon their civil liberties. So today we're going to talk about types of presidential powers. As the powers of the president have grown, the roles that the president have become more complex and complicated. And being president requires balancing or juggling these roles simultaneously. In today's lecture, we will discuss at least 5 constitutional roles of the president, beginning with the chief of state. As chief of state, the president is the ceremonial head of the government, the symbol of the nation. And as that symbol, most of these activities are symbolic. Decorating our war heroes, hosting other countries' heads of state, and representing the nation in times of mourning. Article 2 of the Constitution vests the executive power, or the power to execute and enforce the law. Article 2, Section 3 states that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Of course, the president is just one man, and he gets support from the Department of Justice to do so. The Attorney General, who is the head of the Department of Justice, is the chief law enforcement officer and the lawyer of the United States. The DOJ and the Attorney General are responsible for the enforcement of the law and administration of the justice. The Department of Justice is made up of over 60 agencies, from the U.S. Marshals Service to the FBI to the Agency for Defending Childhood. Most of the work administrating federal law takes place at these bureaucratic levels, but the chief executive has the power to issue executive orders that have the effect of law without going through the legislative process. This is known as the ordinance power, and it is implied in the Constitution, and it is also given by Congress. Every conspiracy theorist's favorite executive order is number 13603, which provides the framework and authority for the allocation or appropriation of resources, materials, services to promote the national defense in times of national crisis. But usually executive orders are much more mundane, like establishing the Bears Ear National Monument in southeastern Utah. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 gives the chief executive the power to appoint ambassadors, cabinet heads, heads of agencies, federal judges, marshals, attorneys, and officers of the armed forces. Acting alone, the president names about 1,000 of the 2.8 million civilians who work for the federal government. When the president makes these appointments, the nomination is sent to the Senate for advice and consent, where a majority of senators present is needed for confirmation. The unwritten rule of senatorial courtesy holds that the Senate will approve only those appointees acceptable to the senator or senators of the president's own party from the state which is involved. The Constitution does allow for the president to make what's called recess appointments to fill up vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate. Since this bypasses senatorial confirmation, all such appointments expire at the end of the congressional term. The Constitution does not say in so many words that the president is the nation's chief diplomat. Rather, the president has come to dominate the field of foreign affairs through the powers of this office, like the power to make treaties, which are formal agreements between two or more sovereign nation-states. The president usually acts through the Secretary of State to negotiate international agreements, and the Senate must ratify such agreements with a 2/3 majority. In recent history, presidents have relied heavily on executive agreements, which do not require senatorial ratification to do more routine business with foreign states. These pacts have the same legal status as treaties, but cannot supersede federal law or law of the separate states. Treaties become permanent parts of the American legal system, whereas agreements do not, and subsequent presidents are not bound by previous presidents' agreements. As chief diplomat, the president can realize and recognize the legal existence of a country. In 1903, Theodore Roosevelt recognized Panama as a sovereign country no less than 3 days after it began its revolt. And in 2016, President-elect Donald Trump went against half a century of diplomatic precedents by recognizing Taiwan independently of China before taking office. And it remains to be seen what the new president will do when he takes office. The Nixon administration used ping-pong teams to encourage new relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. But when ping-pong doesn't work, presidents rely on the State Department and the National Security Council. Similarly, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, and the militia of the several states. Although Congress alone has the authority to declare war, the President still has the power to commit troops. President Harry S. Truman made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an estimated 105,000 Japanese civilians to end World War II. Dwight D. Eisenhower committed the 101st Airborne, an elite combat troop, to ensure the safety of 9 black students going to public schools in Arkansas for the first time. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered bombings of North Vietnam, Nixon in Cambodia, Reagan in Grenada, Clinton in Bosnia, and Bush I in Kuwait and Bush II in Iraq. President Obama has used similar powers to catch Osama bin Laden in the sovereign nation of Pakistan in 2011. If threat and danger are so imminent and immediate that Congress doesn't have time to declare war, the President has authority to commit troops. The problem is defining what is immediate and imminent threats. Who gets to limit the President once he has committed troops? After Vietnam, Congress had watched its war powers dwindle away to the executive branch and passed the War Powers Act in response, which requires the President to get authorization within 60 days or bring the troops back, precisely because we did not want to go into another war that would last more than a decade with poorly defined goals and strategies. And while this seems to be a check on the President's war powers, in practice, Congress has always authorized. Various bureaucracies support the President to fulfill his diplomatic and military powers: the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Pentagon, assist the commander-in-chief. All in all, it is significant to add that the armed forces of the United States are under civilian control. Lastly, the President initiates and blocks legislation and thus fulfills the role of chief legislator. The modern American president uses the media and the State of the Union to initiate policy, as found in Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution. The president can propose legislation, but Congress is not required to introduce it, let alone pass it. It may seem fairly obvious that a president is more successful in passing his agenda with a unified government and at the beginning of his term in office, when his approval ratings are still high. In times of divided government, the president is more likely to block legislation through the veto power, which you are familiar with from the legislative branch. This should be enough to get us started with knowing and understanding the executive branch so that we can discuss them further in class.